What's up, everybody? It's your boy Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates. I am your mental activist, and welcome to episode 4 of Politically Conscious. So I have on our political expert, political consultant, Emille Bryant, black in this thing with us again. Thanks again, actually tuning in from overseas. You're on a trip, so thank you for making way for episode 4. We had pretty much almost missed the cycle, if you will, of the exit poll stuff, but none of them are going to be like ours. None of the exit polls, anything that you've seen out there will not be like Politically Conscious, because we're talking about politics on a little higher level. Go ahead, Emille, introduce yourself, and we'll get right into these exit polls, brother.
Actually, Montoya, my name is Emille Bryant. I'm a political consultant. I'm a management consultant and an author. And one of the things that I am really excited about is actually letting the cycle sort of calm down so we can do some real analysis. Because what you got was hot takes.
That's real.
Let's calm down and let's you and I really dig into this, because there's some numbers that we need to address. And how I got started years ago was almost exactly like this. It was during it was actually during the Bush 1 administration, way back in 1988-89. I was at the Air Force Academy. I had to take classes to understand how politics work vis-a-vis the military. When I graduated, Clinton became the president, and I was hooked. I was trying to understand why I was seeing what I was seeing. And so for years, I have been following politics, trying to understand not so much what is happening, but why it's happening. And so that's what I love talking about with you, Montoya. Why is this happening?
Absolutely. And so right before we jump into the exit polls, I got to call you out from last show. You were so wrong on your prediction.
Oh, but
you
hey,
was off by a mile.
I will own it. I will own it. I was way off.
Mile.
You're not gonna hear me try to defend it. You're not gonna hear me try to support it. I was reluctant to give you any numbers, but you pushed me, and I did put you on the spot. And I was so here's the thing that I saw that made me so off, right? There's a thirst for something in this nation that people wanted that I didn't have my finger on that pulse. And I know why I didn't have my finger on that pulse, because I'm not in the circles where that thirst is strong in my ear. So I own it. I was way off.
Way off. I missed by 1%. I was bragging about it. I was bragging about 4 days ago. I was like, I'm right on it. But when the final numbers came in, Trump ended up winning the popular vote. Let's get into these numbers by 2%, if you will, specifically 75 million to 72 million on the popular vote. The Electoral College actually went almost to your number, but opposite of what it said.
Yep.
As far as how they actually fell. And we won't get into how they fall so different, because we did that last show. We explained exactly how the Electoral College worked. And so that was last episode. But on this episode, I was off by 1%. He won by 2% popular vote. And again, it wasn't about how I voted. It was just me predicting what I saw on the landscape. And then I had to call you out, you being the political consultant and me just being the thinker out here. I actually had my pulse on what was happening, I think, a little better than you might have. But with that said, let me share some of these numbers, because all I want to do is we're going to scroll through them and point out things that stood out to us. I got some things that stood out to me. And so, as I'm going to share the screen real quick so that we can actually let people see what we're talking about, just in case we haven't seen the actual exit polls. So let me share the screen, and let me know if it's pulling up here.
I am 100% okay with being wrong, though. That's something that a lot of these pundits and talkers will. I missed it. I'm not even gonna front and pretend like it was anything but.
Hey, this politically conscious. You can't front on here anyway.
I wouldn't
don't let
try.
you do that on this show. Hey, we say if you don't like the propaganda, tune in to us. So right now, can you see the actual polls that I have pulled up? I want to make sure I'm sharing.
Right, I can see them very well. No problem.
All right, cool. All right, so I'm gonna start from the top, and then let's just we're not gonna go through all the numbers, of course, right? I just want to kind of start from the top, and as I scroll down, anything that stands out to you, let's kind of discuss, and then we'll do what we always do on Politically Conscious, which is get into some actual cuts, political cuts, and then get our live reaction on the air.
That's for sure.
That's what we're mostly known for. But let's dig into these numbers. So, I'm just slowly scrolling down with the top of the numbers. These are obviously from the NBC News, if you will. And so no surprise right here, right, that we see the men in general, just in gender. Mostly men voted for Trump, if you will. women mostly voted for,
Yeah. It's probably the women's number that really surprised a lot of people, myself included. I just expected that there would be a more robust, first of all, turnout from 2020 to 2024 was significantly depressed. So that's a big deal. Overall, almost 10 million fewer voters. But on top of that, the women's vote broke harder for Trump than I thought. I was looking at it from a different perspective than what you see here. And I thought there might be a stronger push given not only Kamala's viewpoints, her policies, and her being a woman, but also the fact is that she would be, if she were president, she would be appointing potentially the next Supreme Court justice, which meant a lot of opportunity for change in the Supreme Court, but that didn't sway those women. And so you see there a really strong indicator of some inertia from the Republican side. I thought it was just really impressive that they were able to maintain the women's vote the way they did.
Fair enough. And so as we keep scrolling down, obviously in our community, there was always, this dialogue about, in a sense, where would the, Black vote be? Once again, not surprised, 85% strong, if you will, for the Democrats or Kamala in this situation. From what I recall, 90%. I got those numbers too. Let me make sure I'm telling people the correct number. So let me jump over here and see. I think it was 90% Biden. So we see a slight dip, if I'm correct. Oh, it's not. Okay. Let me see if I can find it. It's not the one. All right. I had another one. All right. Oh, here it is. All right. So let me see, what was it last time, if I can find it real quick. Hope I can find it quickly.
For sure.
Yeah, okay, 87%. Okay, so not 90%. So 87% during Biden versus Trump last in 2020. And then you see 85% for the Black vote.
Right.
This time.
Black women were very strong for Harris, and they maintained that from the Biden administration. Probably the largest change was that there was a change in the Black male voters for Democrats or for Harris versus for Trump. And a lot of that was, as we talked about last episode, that there was just a lot of holdouts. There was people who just stayed at home. And it wasn't just Black men. It was also Black women who stayed at home. It was also young voters who stayed at home. They just weren't excited for. Now, on the Republican side, there was a bunch of people who also stayed home. They weren't excited either. But the delta, the difference, I think it was 6 million fewer Republican or 6 million fewer Democratic voters versus 4 million fewer Republican voters. So you had a big depressed state. And to your point from last episode, we talked about how each side is trying to functionally disenfranchise the voter by making them not want to come to the polls. Well, that was evident in this cycle. It was as clear as day that people were not motivated to vote this time the way they were last time, or even in 2016.
Not fair enough. Yeah, you have to have transcendent candidates to get a big turnout, which obviously happened, a few years back when President Obama, was some of the biggest turnout, and then last election was a huge turnout as well.
Absolutely. I think it was 80 to 84 million was right in that number.
Yep.
And this time it was 70 to 74 million. So it was a vast difference between the two.
Yeah. So you were pointing out Black men. So let's point out that difference. So Trump in this situation was able to gain 21% of the Black male vote. This time it was 19% at the last election.
Mm-hmm.
And so, pointing it out because within our community, there's always this dialogue, right, between where we go within our community. But you highlighted on the last broadcast that you thought that number would be upwards to 80% Black men, and you're like, you were talking about don't browbeat us when at the end of the day, 80% of us are going to be voting for Kamala in this situation. And so it ended up being 77%, so a little less than you expected. But the big number that everyone's talking about when it comes to the racial dynamic is what the Latino men did, right? That was significant. That was the most significant change
big time
election. So here's the, of course, everybody's been talking about that already with the exit polls. Here's where I think we can go different when it comes to politically conscious. I want to highlight what people are considering a surprise. At least what I've seen on the broadcast this past week, everybody's been surprised by that change. And let's point out the exact change just so that people really know. So for the most part, I've always said historically, and you can tell me if you think this is correct, but historically, always haven't looked at exit polls. I've just said in general, Hispanics are usually split about 60-40, 65-35%. Democrat versus Republican in general, like that's kind of where their numbers tend to land, right, if you will. And so in that sense, Hispanics have leaned left for the most part, most of, at least most of my voting lifespan, if you will. And so what happened was this time, the Latino men, 55% actually voted for Trump. Let's compare that to last time. I think it was a 19% jump. 36% of Latino men voted for Trump in the last election. So that last election held to what I said historically is the case, about 65-35. But it was a significant jump, and that was the biggest difference. So the thing that I wanted to point out, I'll let you jump in, is I'm not surprised, as I've heard all week. And the reason being is because I did this Swell podcast, which is a 5-minute podcast, in which I highlighted going into this election, the term Trump as a racist, in my opinion, was being overused and essentially becoming ineffective. And so all the surprise that I saw with all the political pundits this past week has been the idea of how racist Trump's campaign had been toward the Hispanics, whether it's the Puerto Rican island is trash from the comedian, all these different racial epithets that have been linked to him. And, obviously they've used it. And as I say, both sides use these identity politics, if you will. And so they've used it heavy-handed in the Black community. But if we're honest, Emille, more epithets have been thrown when it comes to immigrants towards the Hispanics. And people will say, wow, look at how they vote with all those racial epithets. The reason I'm not surprised is because this vote shows me that they were more concerned with specific policies than just the use of identity politics towards them as Hispanics. I despise both parties using identity politics over policy. But I think our community is so attached to hearing that methodology that we were surprised to see what we think is the Hispanics vote against someone who's racially against them. That's how it looks to us. And I say this vote proves that they are more concerned with policy than they are the racial identity politics. Go ahead, brother.
I tend to agree. There is a couple of things that I look at when I factor the Latino vote. First of all, the Latino vote is definitely not monolithic. And we always have to remember that there are African descent Latinos, there are native descent Latinos, and then there are European descent Latinos. And so they have a mix of cultures within the Latino community that allows them to be, we lump them all together. And I think when we do a political analysis, we do them a disservice by saying that group as a group should vote a one way or another. I will bristle at the thought that the Black community is monolithic. They are even more or even less monolithic than we ever could be in that context, because they come from multiple countries and multiple socioeconomic backgrounds as immigrants, right? So what happens is the stereotype of the Latino immigrant is someone who maybe didn't come to America legally, or maybe did so under the cover of night or as a refugee, when there's a lot of Latinos who come to America who are following the process, doing right, vibrant contributors to economies. And those people are also not counted well in the analysis. So what you have in the Republican Party is they were able to reach out to those voters who are here legally, who have done the right thing, who have been contributing to the nation's economy in very healthy ways for the last several decades. And they have been consistently overlooked for others in that community, from that community. So when you start to sort of analyze this background, where you say, where do the votes break? What you saw is Trump's support for a specific type of policy, a specific type of approach to immigration appealed to a lot of those voters who were already entrenched in, hey, we believe in a legal process. We believe in a system that works for all, but it should be fair across the board. And this is what they believe is what fair looks like. So there's going to be some intended and unintended consequences from this vote that will specifically impact the Latino community broadly. But specifically, as we begin to break that down, you're going to see that those communities are going to be even more strident in support for some of those policies. And there is going to be some regret that people didn't see coming. And both of those are going to be at loggerheads throughout this next 2 years as people see how these policies play out. But they voted for those policies, very specific
policies. And I want to challenge the African-American community to recognize that the identity politics that we thought should have factored in did not. And I also think that we are becoming more sophisticated, and it actually ends up being an indictment on, I would say, the Democratic Party to keep playing to racial identity politics versus smartly saying, here are the policies that, affect or don't affect your community. Because we talked about plenty of policies that actually benefited a lot of the African-American community, but we are yet to hear it or did not hear it from those campaigns, from that campaign. And again, this is not me going on a side. It's just us dialoguing about this in an honest and direct way. With that said, there's a couple other things that I wanted to point out, and then you can let me know if there's anything else you wanted to point out. But just based on some of the stereotypes, one thing that stood out to me was on the let me see if I can find it here, was the total income. And just as a slight little thing that I noticed, again, just wanted to point out, because we also have this concept that, if you will, the wealthy are for the conservatives or the Republicans, if you will. And I just a small thing. This is a minor number, not a major number, but I just noticed that on the total family income for those making 100,000 and up, 51% of them actually voted for Kamala, if you will. And then you see the 30,000 to 100,000 range, in the sense that real middle class who leaned heavily Trump. And I just thought that's kind of unique based on the political narratives that are surround both parties, if you will. But any thoughts on that? Again, that's just something that stood out to me.
Yeah. So here's one of the worst analyses of the working class that I see in as I sort of listen to people talk about the middle class or the working class, is that Black working class doesn't seem to factor into the words, right? So there's a large population of Black people who fit into these demographics between 30 and 100,000. In fact, a good portion, if not a large minority or majority of our people fall into this bracket of 30 to 100,000. So,
matter of fact, let me say this just to give people a little context. And a lot of times we lose sight of this. It's literally, if it's 43 million of us, maybe 45 million collective, whatever the number is, between 43 or 45, only 2 million are above this. The other 41 million are literally in the bracket you're talking about, as far as how the community goes. Like, people don't really realize, unfortunately, where we sit at with median wealth in this country as a collective. But go ahead, brother. Just wanted to give that little caveat to what you're about to say. Go ahead.
I would give another caveat too, because there are many families who have second and third incomes that come from sources that are not necessarily counted by the IRS. So this is always a formal statistic. It's what the IRS is basically going to report on. But where we see this break is in this working class 30 to 100,000 group. You see them approaching. They're a little bit over half voting for the Republicans. And the reason why is because the Republicans have been able to convince those workers that the things that they're going to produce as policy will result in a cheaper dozen of eggs, right? So everybody talks about the dozen eggs. They say, if eggs were cheaper, people would be happier. Well, the problem that people have perceived, and that the Republicans were able to message very successfully, in my opinion, is the fact that they had the policies that would bring the cost of that dozen eggs down. The question that the Democrats could not answer is, how does this policy result in something that I can feel at the grocery store on Friday, right? And the change between those two messages has been so significant that working class folks, people at that $30,000 to $100,000 level, they were convinced very strongly that Harris did not have the policies for them and that Trump did. And that context really opened the door for Trump to hammer home one point, right? They broke it, I'll fix it. It's expensive now, it'll be cheaper later. Let me have it and watch it go down. And it may be true that his policies might have some effect. I have a different belief because I know how tariffs work. But if things do start to change, he's going to get all the credit, even though they were already on the way down because of the last year of change that's already happened. So It doesn't really matter.
Inflation is already coming down.
Inflation comes down and a dozen eggs cost less. He's going to be like, I was right, and so were you guys.
No, fair enough. And one other thing, a little small thing that stood out to me, and it's just, again, this is politically conscious and thinking about our community. And I've always known this, but I just wanted to point it out. But the Jewish community, not a large constituent of the exit voters, if you will, but 78% for Kamala. And I just kind of highlight that because in a lot of dialogues that we have on the Mental Dialogue talk show, which you see behind my head, which we do race, sex, and culture constantly, there's always this equivalence to the Jewish community being similar to how whites vote, and I just white people vote, if you will. And so I just want to kind of highlight that because it stood out to me, and I don't know that our community realizes that the Jewish community heavily votes Democratic for those that choose to vote. Some probably choose not to due to their religion. If I had to guess, I'm not saying I'm correct on that, but just throwing that out, that that's just something that stood out just as a little quick caveat. That's all I have on the specific numbers. We're going to go to cuts that are going to start talking about some of these same numbers and continue some of the conversations we've already been having. Is there anything else you wanted to point out on the exit polls? Those are just a few that stood out to me.
We can break these down all day, and I don't want to belabor the point, but to your point about Jewish voters, I will say this, that one of the two candidates had a more specific policy about what's happening in the Middle East right now. Okay. And that was one of the reasons why they broke for her the way they did, because that policy was very clear. Was it going to be successful? No. But was it clear? Yes. And so there's questions about the clarity of these policies in terms of what's doable and what's possible and what's probable. And when people see that those are happening all at the same time, there's going to be some challenges that these candidates can overcome. And one of the things that I saw is that there was a group of voters who are not in this demographic. They are traditionally or religiously Muslim, who didn't see a solution coming from the Democrats the way they had hoped they would. So when they were not affected by the policies that they saw, they voted for the other side, even though they had even fewer policies. But what they were looking for out of one side, they couldn't countenance. So what happened was you see a demographic of voters who shifted Muslim people who identify as Muslim, but who aren't necessarily included in a lot of these statistics. But there were several million voters. Not just in Michigan, Dearborn being the sort of capital of Muslim activity in America, but across the nation, they did not vote the way that the Democrats had expected them to. And a lot of that was because they did not specify some policies that they thought should have been specified.
No, that's a good explanation for that. And then one other thing, just to take one little dig at you before we go back to our video. I should say go to the videos. Let me stop sharing the screen. Was you were thinking part of your I'll say I'm gonna call it, you were disillusioned about where the voters were. Again, it's not about how you and I voted, it's just our predictions. But when you were talking about the work she was doing to kind of bring those moderate Republicans over, and I can't find the number here, but it ended up being pretty much, if people were Democrats, they stuck with their party. If they were Republicans, they stick with their party. So she wasn't able to successfully bring as many Republicans over as you thought, because you were saying that's what you thought was going to play the biggest role in her winning in a significant way. But unfortunately, people kind of stayed their party. The moderates kind of voted slightly for her, but people stayed in their party. So that's kind of where your miss was, just to kind of throw it out.
Oh, big time. And one of the reasons why, and we have some comments in the chat that I think are absolutely spot on in some of their meta-analysis, psychological way of thinking. But one of the problems is that I don't think Kamala gave the people a chance to see how she operates. She told them how she thinks, but I don't think she did a good job of telling how they operate. And I think that, like, for instance, if you have Liz Cheney on the same stage as Kamala Harris, that could work for you. But before all of the change that Liz Cheney went through, she was a hardcore conservative Republican, hardcore, right? Way to the right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And then as the Tea Party shifted politics, she got thrown to the side because she was more considered establishment conservative versus this more reactionary way of things that have been transpiring over the last few years. So bringing her on stage wasn't going to sway the hardcore conservatives. They were already in the Republican camp. Those moderates also did not see her as somebody who was there. So you saw no significant change, even though she got a plethora of Republican votes. But I'm real quick, I just want to address this one point. America has trouble understanding how to see itself sometimes. And I say that sort of tongue in cheek. We know who we are and we don't like it sometimes. So we will vote what we think we are versus what we actually are. So what we are actually is a multicultural community, but what we think we are might be dominated by what one person looks like versus what another person looks like, or what one person is perceived as tough, strong, forthright, and the other one who's perceived as not those things. So when you see that, you're also seeing a very traditional break between what people think America is, and they'll vote for that, and what America actually is, and they'll vote for that. And although the two candidates were not necessarily super far away from each other in terms of politics, they were in terms of what we actually are, multicultural, and what we think we are, which is something not that.
Hey, fair enough. I would offer, and I want to talk. Well, I'll get into this later. I want to share this piece before I get into our first cut. And what I want to go with this, again, we've kind of broke down the exit polls, at least from my perspective. Where I want to go with this, because to your point at the beginning of the show, saying, hey, we let everything kind of settle down. So that now that we've settled down and, we absolutely know, Donald J. Trump is going to be the 47th president. So what I would like to highlight is some dialogue around having a better perspective about one another based on how people voted. We know how visceral voting and how emotional and how important it is to people, and people lose friends during this time. I have a piece in my book, Re-Education of the Negro, about not allowing religion or politics to have you lose friends and that type of thing. So I wanted to kind of just dialogue and get into this thing that I think people are amiss on, which is there's this comment that people make, that people vote outside their own interests. I think it's a huge mistake to believe that people are voting outside their interests. And I'm going to share this piece of the sister who summarizes her viewpoint after President Trump was elected. Her name, she goes by Sixth Goddess. And I'm going to share this piece. And I just want to kind of say to anyone listening or anybody who watches this, that on Politically Conscious, we want to challenge your dissonance. We want to challenge. That's what we do at Mental Dialogue. We're bringing that to Politically Conscious. So what you're about to hear is not a thing to talk about whether I personally agree or disagree with it. Is to come to an understanding of, during politics, your cognitive dissonance is going to be triggered to the point where if somebody disagrees, you don't want to hear it. And I'm saying, stick through this messaging to dialogue about how to become more politically conscious so that you are paying attention to policies and are not driven by rhetoric. So you're going to hear some rhetoric in this piece, but I'm warning people. But again, it's not about what side we are on. I want to say something after the piece. So bear with me. It's just a 2-minute piece. So let me share this piece. I'm going to read it to y'all out loud right now. Hopefully I can read it very clearly. Again, this is a piece. This is a commentary by Sixth Goddess after the election. She says, people do not like Trump because he represents a family of 6'8" strong alpha males who are generationally invested in America and extremely successful, heterosexual. don't give a fuck, anti-gay, transgender, patriarchal, Christian, and are about putting America first. America did the right thing, choosing family and patriarchal over liberal, chaotic, all over the place, anything goes leadership from a stranger woman who is an autistic Indian who has been a single hoe until 50 years old and never gave birth, and has family on both sides who aren't American, which gives her somewhere else to go and means they aren't generationally invested in the country they're asking to be in charge of. It's so strange that propaganda has people fearing a man who already was president. There was no handmade tale vibes. Nobody died. Like I promised, y'all will be all right. I see nothing scares y'all more than possibly not being able to delete your babies, which is sad, even though he never outlawed baby deletions. True Americans would obviously vote for Dunny. I don't know why non-Americans think their families won't be able to come here. They will. They just have to do it legally now, as they should. Not liking someone being mean, or someone not having the education level they feel they should is not enough to not choose them as a leader. The devil always tells you what you want to hear. We are safe under strong male leadership. Kamala showed right away that a bullet was dodged when she lost, got an attitude and wouldn't come out to speak. A man would have sucked it up and did what he had to do. And that's why women do not need to be in leadership positions to that degree. Imagine the president having a hot flash while meeting with world leaders. Menopausal hormones in the Oval Office is crazy. And please do not get me started on the ridiculous narrative that he enables racism. Just stop. Racism is the blood of this country, and people like who is currently in office are the real racists. America has chosen to turn its back on the concept of keeping people weak and disorganized, so they will always need you, and embrace structure, self-sufficiency, and being responsible for your own well-being. Families will win, and that's what makes people upset in this anything goes current society. Congratulations to the Trump family. Now back to the money. Scathing commentary from her perspective, correct? That's her perspective. Here's what I deem out of it. Again, get into a dialogue of not allowing politics to divide us. What I deem out of that, and when I listen to her, whatever you disagree with or whatever you feel is extreme, when I read that, I absolutely understand why she voted the way that she did. That's my bigger point. The bigger point, I'm not talking about whether I agree with her or not. I heard her values. She clearly kind of laid it out, even in her, part that was being extreme or not extreme, but she laid out what was important to her. My bigger point is, when I say people make the mistake of saying people vote against their interests, it's actually a level of arrogance to assume what an individual's interests and values are. When you actually know someone's values, people will literally go, when it comes to politics, we literally calls each other stupid because you're not understanding, one, what that person values, and two, you think they're not smart. But when I hear any individual's values and what's important to them, you actually can say, oh, forget the candidate. I know who they're going to vote for based on what that person values. So I'm using this sister as a Black woman who clearly, she didn't say even how she voted in that actual piece. I don't know. I'm just clearly, we can assume that she voted for Trump, but she didn't say that she did. So I'm not going to put something on her that I don't know, but I'm highlighting the ideal within our community to think that someone is voting against their interests. When I read what she wrote, I clearly understand why she voted. And the reason I'm making that point and I'm reiterating that point is, when you get to know someone and understand their values, you actually will stop calling them stupid. And we all should move away from that, because you cannot assume and be arrogant what someone else's interests personally are. Go ahead, brother.
So this is one of the challenges that we face in America, and that is the way we educate ourselves is not extensive enough for us to have good discussions with each other about policies the way we should have them, right? So when she says all that she says, there were policies inside of what she said that absolutely, if you listen to Donald Trump's entire message and watch his policy as he begins to write and execute these policies that go against some of the things that she says. But that's okay, because that's not what her belief was, right? So we have to really respect that people are coming to the table with these beliefs. And when we say that they vote against their interests, we're looking at it from what interests should they have, right? What beliefs?
I call BS on that. Go ahead. Though.
Absolutely. What beliefs should they have, right? And you say, if you are in this socioeconomic category, then you should want policies that do this thing. Well, the problem is that there are people in the higher socioeconomic strata who actually want to pay more taxes because they see the value of that. And there are people in the lower socioeconomic strata who value that their tax dollars goes to pay for fire and police and defense. Like, you can't just broadly say that this is one way or this is the other way based on simply socioeconomic. So when I hear people say they're voting against their interests, here's what I want people to do. I want them to go back and look at the voters who instituted policies and see if those voters feel, not are,
that's what matters,
like their priorities have been upheld. Because you have people in parts of the country who do not want federal help. They would rather starve than take federal dollars. Those same people will vote against their interests because they're not willing to take federal assistance because they don't believe in it, even though it should help them and would help them if they were to take it. They don't take it. So you have a group of people who seem to act against their own interest, and that is a normal, healthy part of a democracy where people are not going to fall into neat little categories. And as long as we understand that, we can talk to these things differently. Now we can have these discussions, like you were saying earlier, about when we talk to one another, we shouldn't let religion or politics separate us, not family or friendship, because each of us has our own motivation. I get frustrated that our political education, our civics education, isn't robust enough for us to understand the first, second, and third order effects of the policies people say they want to implement, how those will transpire in our lives. It would be nice if we all could understand that when someone says they're going to cut taxes, there's going to be a commensurate cut in service, right? You can't cut income and not cut outlays, right? So then the question is, what outlays would we cut if we were going to cut taxes or cut the money going into investing? If you say you're going to cut the Department of Education, where does that money go? Are we just not going to spend that money? Or are you going to send that to the states and with block grants? Are you going to let them spend the money as they see fit? These are questions that have first, second, and third order effects that we're not having those kinds of discussions on a regular basis. And because of that, we're getting a lot of people's feelings into the conversation, and those feelings do matter because, to your point, they are what people are voting for. They're voting for what they feel America should be. They feel what America should do. They feel how America should act on the world stage. And those feelings, whether they're informed by fact or not, matter to the voter.
Matter so much so that neither side should think the other side is stupid. Like both sides should get out of that space, because you have to respect what that individual values. You know, another quick example of this, I'm gonna play another cut, is like, to a degree, we understand that there's this concept of a one issue voter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, obviously with you being a political pundit and understanding those layers you talked about, it's fair for you to say that a one issue voter, you could fairly say, without being derogatory, that they're not a sophisticated voter. I'm saying specifically someone like yourself, Emille, who's always involved and understand politics to a much higher degree than I. So you could fairly say that they're not a sophisticated voter, right? But what the mistake that we make is you can't also say that they're stupid, because what happens is, if your one issue is being able to go out and shoot your AK because you got one and have it at all costs, and that's what has a material effect that you know on your lives, I can understand how that one issue gun voter, right, is only going to be on the side of, because The rest of the politics, they're not going to no town hall meetings. The way they living, they not even they might say, oh, like you pointed out earlier, the eggs are a little higher than they used to be, but that ain't their concern. They don't. What I'm saying is, so we can look. Somebody can look down on that one issue voter, but you're not respecting what matters to that one issue voter. Same thing for a woman who says, I want to have access to abortion freely. So for like for the sister that I read in a piece, she clearly is against. I'm personally against abortion, right? She's against abortion, right? So she can say she doesn't agree with her, but she couldn't call that woman stupid who wants to have access to abortion. Like, people do that, but it's actually the emotional divisiveness that gets us divided because we don't have a respect for even a one issue voter or what concerns people. And here's the reality that I always love to point out when we were talking about the number of turnout. There's always 30% of people who stay at home that could give two about all this dialogue that we find important enough to say, I block you, you are no longer my friend. And there's 30% who I don't get involved in any of that, and a little higher than 30% this time. I always point out, for as crazy as where we think the country is going, no matter when Barack became the president or now that Donald Trump has returned, at the end of the day, about 35% of the people pick the president because of the people that the third that don't turn out. Right. So we'll go. The country is like, I had a friend I already had this dialogue with right before this show. I'm just like, well, it's for those that are afraid and have bought into all of the identity politics. We literally just had a black president for eight years, and then a 4 years removed. As much as people are, and again, this is not me talking about whether Trump is racist or not. I'm pointing out the context so we can have smarter conversations. So as much as we're saying the country has picked a racist president, well, he only beat a multicultural woman, and to this sister's point, who's Indian, Asian, black, whatever you may want to say, he only beat about 3 million votes. I want to keep in context that for as crazy or as afraid that anybody who thinks our country is going in this direction, he beat a multicultural woman by 3 million votes. Like we have to put in context. This is the best. Our personal black ancestors, we have had it better than any ancestor ever. We've experienced 8 years of a black president, and a multicultural woman barely missed the office by 3 million votes.
Who has been vice president for damn near 4 years, right? So let's be very clear. And this is something that I think let's go back to the single issue voter just for a second. That single issue voter cares deeply about, to the point where live or die. And unfortunately, the lack of sophistication in our political dialogue, especially from our candidates, doesn't allow them to have any nuance. It's abortion or not abortion. Nobody says, hey, if you want to stop abortion, by the way, you can look up these numbers. It's a joyful exploration. If you really want to cut abortion, you don't pass a law. You give people jobs and hope. That's how you cut abortion, because unwanted pregnancy goes down when people have jobs and hope. So you get away from abortion. So anti-abortion only means, in the context of our conversations in our unsophisticated politics, Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, or not. But in other ways, we can have a much more nuanced conversation. What policies can we put in place that encourage young men and young women not to have sex before marriage, or if they do, to do it protected, and to reduce the amount of unwanted pregnancies that turn into unnecessary abortions? That conversation is not happening at the policy level, because nobody wants to have a nuanced conversation about how to stop abortion without necessarily changing the law on the extremes, right? So you got to go either or, boom, boom, instead of this more nuanced conversation, empowering churches, empowering schools. So the single issue voter has been reduced to the extreme voter. Either or, I'm voting for that single issue, whereas we're not having the more nuanced political conversation about what it means. Do you want to have a gun? Gun control does not mean gun ban, but we don't talk about that. We say gun ban or no ban. And I always say, I do not want people having access to nuclear weapons, so I'm all for some sort of gun control. But does that mean I want a ban on guns? No. And they said, well, what about this? What about that? I can show you programs from places like Switzerland that would absolutely work in America if we were to adopt them, but that's a nuanced political conversation versus on or off, binary yes, no. So when we talk about the single issue voter, they're not dumb. They're so passionate about that issue that they do not care what is attached to that single issue. And for both sides, what they do is they tack on a bunch of BS policies to that single issue to bring that voter over to them so they can say, hey, other voters not single issue, do you agree with a lot of these other things? So you have national defense or national security. You have international aid and foreign relations. Then you have domestic relations. And then you have within that all of the things that go into. But the parties, the way they're organized right now, they don't want to have a sophisticated conversation about that single issue. They know which ones are hottest.
Well, and I've also on one of my swells, maybe a year or two ago, I pointed out that Trump becoming the president, that he's actually, I would say an indictment is his language and how he talks has actually lowered it to make it even more difficult to have a more nuanced conversation like you're talking about. Matter of fact, let me play this cut and see what you think about it. But I just, like I said, I would just add that even his approach to politics, like if you look at debates from 20 years ago, it was way more policy being discussed because they would all, both candidates would get prepped by their economic staffs to be able to intelligently look like they know what the hell they're talking about, because they wouldn't just state a policy, they would have to tell the how, and they would debate about the how. We no longer debate about the how or have the nuance, and I would offer that this is part of the reason why. Let me play this cut here.
When Trump speaks, it's a bit like fingernails on a chalkboard for me. But I take this vote as a commentary on, I don't want a slick politician. I don't want somebody who every line feels rehearsed. I want somebody that can sit down with Joe Rogan for 3 hours, shoot the shit, say what they think, and not feel like, and this was the thing that freaked me out about the Democratic run at all of this. And I won't even say Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris always felt like a figurehead to a blob that I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they wanted. And I think a lot of people feel that.
Let me play one more cut too. Before
how do you explain? He obviously swept the battleground states. He drove up, turnout around the country in Republican areas, but he did much better than he had done before in places like Chicago, Brooklyn, Queens.
Because of dinner table issues. It's literally that simple. Every day, people wake up and all they want to do is have more money in their pocket and they want to feel safe. I don't care if you're black, white, gay, straight, whatever religion you are. Those are the two things that you're thinking about every day. How can I keep some money in my pocket and how can I stay safe? And when you look at, issues like the economy, when you look at the border, and that's what I was telling people. We had this conversation back in February. Yep. I was having conversations with folks and they was telling me, oh my God, these gangs are coming into our neighborhood. And I know it's because of the border. We got to close the border. Like, they were having these conversations. And I told you, John, this was the first time in my life that I heard people in my community, black people, brown people, having those conversations. So that was going to be an issue. They felt like things were safer. They felt like the border was safer, under Trump. And by the way, it's not like the Democrats didn't want border security. They just didn't know how to message it right. Build the wall may sound elementary, but you know what that signals to people? Border security. That's it. Yeah. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't complicate it by saying, we got to have the most comprehensive border plan. And, there's a bipartisan, border bill that Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on. And Donald Trump shot it down. No, Trump is saying build the wall. And when they were telling you that it was a problem, y'all was saying, no, it's not a problem. Let's create sanctuary cities and let's bring, the people into our cities. And so when they started putting those, illegal immigrants on the buses and on the planes and sending them to those sanctuary cities, what did they say then? No. Don't come. So it looked like the Republicans were right and Democrats were wrong. And nobody knew that was going to be one of the big central issues that people thought about when they went into that voter booth.
I think it speaks to what you're talking about, right? And so, as I was just saying that, so Trump being the master salesman, build the wall. I'm going to deport immigrants. Like simple statements. In the past, a president would have had to deliver the how. That would be the whole part of the conversation, right? But
right.
Again, this is not me for or against. I'm just talking about the dialogue amongst what has effectively become why we are less capable, in my opinion, of having sophisticated conversations, because we had a candidate that mastered playing to that, and another side who doesn't understand how to feel. I don't know that we'll
absolutely.
get.
It's kind of a self-licking ice cream cone to me. Like, we don't have a robust education in high school. People do not talk nuanced politics at the dinner table. They talk what Charlemagne the God talked about. I call it gross, not gross as in gross, nasty, gross as in just big chunky things, right? The dinner table, cost of eggs, how much it costs at the gas station. Why all that matters? It doesn't matter, right? So we're actually less sophisticated about the how things happen, because all we care about is the result. Do I have more money in my account than I did last year? If I do, great, but there's a cost to that. And here's the cost. And this is the problem that a lot of politicians are not able to, it's a chasm that's growing. The cost is, when we do start talking about how, are we able to manage the intended and unintended consequences as an electorate? Do I see the good and bad effects of the decisions I want them to make? And if I can't see those bad decisions, if they don't affect me in a material way, do I care? Do I care about my neighbor if they're affected by these policies? Oh, the potholes in my street are filled. I'm good. Well, does that mean that the city dump that was once 20 miles outside the city moved to, 3 doors down from your house? I mean, that's an extreme example. But if the cost of filling potholes was to have the city dump right next door to your house, you would say, hey, maybe I don't want those potholes filled because I don't want this other consequence. But we're not having those discussions, and the politicians have made it very clear they're not going to have those discussions. Why? Because Hillary in 2016 spoke on the how. She was very polished on the policies.
But she was up against Trump. Wasn't going to speak to the how.
Right.
And in my opinion, brought the rhetoric down to where we see today.
Absolutely.
I think that's been a consequence of the politics and the debate.
Absolutely.
Look like...
we don't have a robust, and people are so in it. And this is another part of let's talk about just modern times real quickly. But people are inundated with options, and one of those options used to be years ago when you had 3 major networks and maybe CNN or maybe CNN and Fox, but you didn't have a lot of entertainment options. When you watch the news, part of the news's job was to break down some of these issues in ways that you could understand. So if you go back and look at the moon landing from the 60s and you see how they did the graphics and all that sort of stuff, they were fairly sophisticated. You couldn't do what they did in 1969 in 2024 because you would get turned off like that, right? And these policies are just like that. They're very wonky. They're very intricate. Like, let's imagine, how do you govern a nation of 380 million? Well, it's going to take some level of detail. People do not have patience for detail when they have a billion options on the internet and cable TV that they can turn to, where it's just boring. And I'm not saying that people are dumb. I'm saying that it's just not part of our normal day-to-day conversation to go into detail when you have people who say, I can fix it, and okay, just make my potholes go away. Just make my
I love that analogy. And let me say this. Yes, it's the consequence of going from you pick up your paper to read the news everyday society, which is how you got the majority of the news when the world everybody couldn't afford a TV, to now it's in our hands quickly. So it's a natural consequence of technology to a degree. So the thing that I hate the most that comes out of this election is there's this constant conversation we have on Mental Dialogue about the gender war and how large it is. I'm talking about specifically for the African-American community.
Yes.
The thing I hate the most about politics is that it actually plays into that, and there's no in my opinion, no reality in which it should. Once again, considering to your point on the last show, that if you feel that your alignment to one party, which I'm not a fan of, I think we should jump around parties personally. But if your alignment to the Democratic Party somehow was equated to your blackness, we're the one race that overwhelmingly votes for them. So why would we ever be having an argument amongst our own about how we're voting when it comes to that? Again, I think we should be politically smart and jump around and be independents and jump on both sides to vote people out. I'm more concerned with you must do something for my vote, or I will jump to the other side and vote you out, because I think that gives me a voice. If I don't have the money to pay for one of your $1,000 fundraisers, that gives me a voice because I got the money. So if all I got is a vote, I'm willing to jump on either side to get your ass out. And I'm not talking about the presidential election now. I'm talking about local. So again, I just wanted to kind of throw in my caveat, because people might think I'm, just they're more concerned about where I stand versus what I'm saying, if you will. So I just want to be clear on that. So I'm gonna play this cut that highlights why there should not, in my opinion, be a significant difference in how we move with politics amongst our community when it comes to this gender war. Again, let people vote for their personal interests. Don't have the arrogance to think that you know someone's other personal interests. I'm reiterating that, but the bigger thing is we shouldn't be arguing at all. And here's a clip that, in my opinion, proves that.
I highlight something that the data from this year's election showed us about men in America. White men don't trust white women in leadership. The data showed us. Latino men don't trust Latino women in leadership. The data showed us. Black men do not struggle with black women in leadership. The data showed us, because overwhelmingly black men voted for Kamala Harris. And even in 2016, the only race of men to overwhelmingly vote for Hillary Clinton were black men. There's constantly a narrative about black men. And yes, there are black men with their egos on their sleeves. Yes, there are black men chasing proximity to whiteness and a bag. But the majority of black men, unlike other races of men, are not chasing just a bag, but we are considering our humanity and yours and what's at stake every day for the women in our lives, as well as the people that we care about. So this logic that black men are against black women is just not true. There are black men who want to be heard, though, that want their perspectives to be valued and that want to be seen as the base of the party along with black women, because we're the only people in this country who consistently show up and do our part along with black women. And so it's time that we recognize that and not let the fraction of us that go over there chasing proximity be the ones that get the conversation over the majority of us who consistently show that we do not struggle with women in leadership. We want our voices to be heard by the women that lead.
And again, I would love to see us be cross-party as a culture, as a block, and use it effectively locally. Again, not nationally, because we're only 12%. So I don't think that what I'm saying is, just to be clear for anybody listening, I don't think that what I'm suggesting is necessarily something that can be done nationally. But I'm in Atlanta. If you're in Detroit, if you're in Jackson, Mississippi, you get whoever out of office who ain't listening to you, and I don't care what letter they got behind their name. And so what I'm saying, I think, is very effectively locally to block vote for either party to get someone out of office. I just want to be very clear. But I think that cut that brother just broke down is no way politics should be bringing up a gender war right now when we consistently block vote the same. So why are we arguing or ever allowing, because the party has done this, ever allowing black folks or black men or black women to be blamed for anything? And here's the real caveat to it all. Again, I'm obviously talking about our community, but at the end of the day, a politician is supposed to earn your vote. So we shouldn't let none of these pundits, none of these parties ever blame us as constituents or the American people for anything. If they didn't earn our vote, that's on them. Do not let them divide us with this BS, and I call all BS, particularly when it comes to the quote unquote gender war in the black community and politics. It's silly. Go ahead, brother.
You will never hear a Republican blame black men for not voting for them if they lose. Period. Never. You'll never hear that conversation. Donald Trump didn't say, black guys didn't vote for me, that's why I lost in 2020. No. So we obviously vote together. We obviously care. The most progressive voter in the world, the most progressive male voter in the world is probably the black voter in the United States of America. Not just in America. We're the most progressive male voter, but we're the most progressive male voter across probably the planet, and certainly in the top 3. And I say that because when people stoke the gender war between black men and black women, they have to go find the margins. They have to go find the extremes. They do not talk about the bulk because that doesn't sell newspapers. It doesn't sell advertising. It doesn't get eyeballs on it. If we were to put real energy behind where we find common ground, you would have a much different conversation than the gender war. But the gender war makes money, makes people famous. I'm not for it either. And to your point about block voting, here's what matters. You know, I am a big proponent of primaries. I will say it over and over again. The primary is where the power is. If you don't like the choices in the last general election, then you hit the primary for the next general election and you make some changes to those choices, because that's where the power is. And when we start to have these conversations about power, you can take your block. And although it doesn't have to be as large as it would be for a general election, you can take your block and you can make some major changes at the primary level. There are some great candidates that black men and black women could choose from either party if they knew the power of the primary. Some states have open primaries, which means you can vote both.
Right.
Both.
I'm not in one of those states, but yeah, that's beautiful. If you're
that's
one of
a powerful, powerful position that people don't.
I'm an independent, so I'm always thrown out,
right,
in my state or whatever when it comes to some of that.
I'm just always concerned that we don't know where we stand in the power position because we think that the vote has to be monolithic or it has to be only at every 4 years. But to your point about the gender war, it does not exist by the numbers. And yes, you can go to the barbershop and hear some really crass things, and you can go to the beauty salon and hear some really ugly things. But you know what you will not see from those conversations is Black folks voting in ways that are against what they believe is their best interest. So those conversations in the barbershop and beauty salon aren't affecting how we vote in the way that people want us to believe. They're not. And because of that, we should not be having conversations about gender wars. We should be having conversations about what's in the interest of our people and using our vote more strategically to get those interests met.
So I hope that if anything is learned, again, when I say both sides play identity politics, I want to be real clear here. As we talked about with the right, if you will, it's kind of like, oh, we'll let you be. They never speak to a policy. So either side gives us policy. But we want to play out this one thing. And when they're spent this week, now that President Trump has been elected, and now the week is let's figure out who we want to blame. And that's what's been going with most of these expo shows. Well, what I want to highlight and call this out, which I'm not saying something people don't notice, but I just want to put this context in. I hope that the Democratic Party learns its lesson in how they rolled out Obama, tried to browbeat Black men, as we kind of pointed out, how it's such a mistake because right after it didn't work, what did Kamala do? She rolled out her Black agenda, which she vowed when running previously there wouldn't be policy specifically for Black people because it would, as we talked about, it could uplift the whole, especially if we're disproportionately in one of these areas. That's what politics does. That's how we should understand it. Because as we talked about on the last show, people mistake how to see where the tangibles are. But as soon as they saw that it was a big mistake to have Obama come out, she immediately rolls out a Black agenda, which she said she never would. So I'm just,
and it wasn't even a good agenda. If you looked at the agenda for Latino men and you looked at the agenda for Black men, there was a significant difference.
Wow.
And the things that were for the Latino men were awesome.
Wow.
How many Black men are invested in cryptocurrency? That should not have been a major policy point from her platform. But if you look at the Latino vote, Latino platform, one of them was housing. Ours didn't have housing. It was amazing that there was a giant gap between those two. Take a look and you'll see. And that's one of the major messaging pitfalls that she fell into. I'm not saying you should not have a Black agenda, but if you're going to have one, roll it out early, be serious about it, and let people know that this agenda, which is targeted for, has effects for all, right? Something I believe that people don't understand in big politics is what's good for Black people is good for all people. There's no program that benefits us that is not good for the rest of America. If we say we want better education and you make our schools better, everybody's school is getting better.
Period.
Always. It doesn't matter the program. So if that's true, why not roll out policies targeted toward a demographic like us that when you speak on them, say, this is how we're going to get everybody. President Obama took a lot of heat for saying a rising tide lifts all boats, because a lot of times our boats seem to be anchored to the bottom. But what I will say is a black tide lifts all boats for sure.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I think she made her giant mistake. She had policies specific to Black men where those policies were not really appealing to the large mass of Black men who already voted for her and were going to vote for her. Rather, she would hit some marginal stuff. At least 2 of those 5 points that I saw were marginally good at best. I'm like, they're really not serious. But the Latino platform, spot on. I thought that was a great platform. Had she run on that with us, bam, we would have all been good. So I agree with you, man. Like, if you're going to do it differently than what we've seen happen so far.
Yeah, no more rolling out the sexy reds and the Meg Stallions, thinking that is an effective way to improve.
No, they need to roll out a Montoya Smith.
Hey, I'm with that. Hey, man, we had our time, man. I think we've done a good job with this episode 4. So y'all just stay tuned. Subscribe. I always forget to say that. So subscribe to the Mental Dialogue YouTube page, and so you'll get alerts anytime that, because we're doing these shows as pop-up. So I still have the regular Mental Dialogue talk show every Saturday morning. Emille, I think you have a podcast from time to time. If you want to highlight it, I don't know if you do or not, but if you do, you can highlight it before we go.
Oh, it's totally apolitical. It's called A Leak of Hope and Change. And my sister and I, we enjoy good conversation once a week. And we talk about the topic of the day. So you'll like last week, we talked about Veterans Day because I am a veteran and so are you. We've talked about things about our family. We've had on guests. So where I'm very political here on my other podcast, A Leak of Hope and Change, my nickname is Change on that podcast. We're apolitical by design, trying to uplift and empower people and give y'all something to smile about or think about in a healthy, positive way.
No, absolutely. And if you're in Atlanta this Friday, the smartest event in the city, every third Friday, the Mental Dialogue Live Experience. We're doing it at an offsite, DBS Sounds, an actual record store. So we're going to be discussing music and culture, giving away prizes. Go to mentaldialogue.com to keep up with that. All right, Politically Conscious episode 4. We're out. If you're tired of the propaganda, listen to us.
Peace, y'all.